One thing about expanding into Canada, you immediately have as an audience some of the most sophisticated hockey fans in the world. Tremendous loyalty to the game, and I think tremendous loyalty to the NHL.
En effet, le club annonce le centre Peter Stastny, âgé de 23 ans.
Peter shifts over the line, has Anton open. Across for Anton, and he scores!
The influence of Peter Stastny and his brothers is still being felt today.
Score! Quebec has won the series!
There was so much confidence in here. I never ever doubted, we're going to win this game.
Look at this, you got both clubs coming on the ice. Look out. Look out.
The Quebec Nordiques are very proud to select L'affaire Lindros.
For the Quebec Nordiques, they're off to the U.S. and they will not be coming back.
I don't think anybody's going to blame us by not taking the engagement to lose that kind of money for many years to come with no hope.
(1979). Irvin Magic Johnson leads Michigan State to a national basketball championship over Larry Bird's Indiana State. McDonald's rolls out its Happy Meal nationally, and the NHL secures its stranglehold over the hockey world. That summer, after years of negotiation, the NHL finalized a transformative merger with its biggest rival, the World Hockey Association. As part of the merger, which cemented the NHL as the supreme North American professional hockey league, the NHL absorbed 4 WHA teams: the Edmonton Oilers, the Winnipeg Jets, the New England Whalers, who would soon become known as the Hartford Whalers, and the Quebec Nordiques. And that last one was particularly noteworthy, for several reasons. While the Nordiques were one of the WHA's original franchises, and ultimately one of its more successful teams on the ice, Quebec City wasn't widely thought of as a major league market. Its population totaled less than 200,000, and the city was predominantly francophone. Plus, the province of Quebec already had an NHL franchise. Actually, it had the most accomplished franchise in NHL history, the Montreal Canadiens. At the time, no other province had more than one NHL team, and when the NHL's owners were deciding on whether to merge with the WHA, Montreal was ultimately one of the few teams to vote against it. However, the Canadiens, which were owned by the Molsons, like of Molson beer, eventually changed their tune. See, their no vote prompted folks throughout Quebec and the WHA's other Canadian markets to boycott Molson.
The boycott is hurting the company in all 3 cities. Though Molson's won't comment, in Edmonton there was a report that sales had dropped 30%. How much Molson's have you sold so far tonight?
5 bottles.
How much will you have normally sold by this time?
3 cases. They bought the Canadians, and when they bought it, they wanted the publicity that goes with it, so they're getting some of the publicity.
In light of that, for the sake of their market share, and with some encouragement from Canadian Parliament, the Habs reversed their stance and the merger went ahead.
One thing about expanding into Canada, you immediately have as an audience some of the most sophisticated hockey fans in the world. Tremendous loyalty to the game, and I think tremendous loyalty to the NHL.
With that, the Nordiques, the proverbial little brother of Quebec hockey, became an NHL franchise, kickstarting a run as electrifying as it was brief. Because the Nordiques were, to borrow a modern-day phrase, a disruptor. Not only did they dismantle Montreal's monopoly over NHL hockey in Quebec, splitting loyalties and challenging identities across the province, but the Nordiques, more than any other team, had a discernible politics to them. As a proudly French team whose jersey featured the fleur-de-lis, the emblem on the flag of Quebec, the Nordiques came to embody the separatist sentiment that had engulfed much of the province for decades. For as long as they existed, the Nordiques were one of the most visible symbols of the Quebecois quest for independence, something that many Quebecers still long for today. That said, as immediate and significant as their impact was, culturally and politically, the Nordiques, like most expansion teams, got off to a rough start on the ice. Despite making it to the championship semifinals in their final WHA season, the Nordiques' transition to the NHL was a sobering one. And it wasn't because their roster was pillaged through the post-merger redistribution, which entitled the 17 pre-existing NHL teams to reclaim their former players that had left for WHA clubs. In fact, the Nordiques swung deals to ensure that they kept many of their key players, including 2-time WHA leading scorer Réal Cloutier and 2-time WHA leading scorer Mark Tardif. Compared to the 3 other WHA imports, their roster was largely the same. Still, the Nordiques won only 25 games in 1979-1980, finishing with the worst record in the Prince of Wales Conference. But amid their struggles, there were reasons for optimism. Like, for instance, the play of 19-year-old Michel Goulet, who scored 22 goals and finished with 54 points in 77 games. And there were reasons for pride, too. Most notably, the Nordiques pulled off a momentous victory that October when they defeated the mighty Canadiens for the first time, beating them 5-4 in a stunning upset in the second ever Battle of Quebec. That night, the Nordiques achieved a new level of legitimacy. They were finally on the same level as the venerated Canadiens, and although their first season was lackluster overall, that victory was a harbinger of better days ahead. That bright future came quick, too. The ensuing offseason was a monumental one for the Nordiques, whose president, Marcel Aubu, was decidedly bold in his efforts to add more impact talent to his roster. That August, Aubu helped facilitate the defection of a pair of Czechoslovakian superstars, Peter and Anton Stastny.
There was so much interest, written offer, contracts, but I couldn't because of the regime. Leaving meant hurting your family.
At the time, with Czechoslovakia under Soviet rule, the brothers took a huge risk by defecting, but the harrowing ordeal worked out swimmingly in the end for all parties involved. Their arrival bolstered Quebec's growing nucleus of young talent in a major way, and ultimately turned the Nordiques into a playoff team in just their second season. In 1980-81, despite getting off to a brutal 1-9-5 start that led the team to install Michel Bergeron as their new head coach, the Nordiques clawed their way to 78 points and a postseason berth on the backs of several breakout performances. Peter, the elder Stastny brother, took home the Calder Trophy with 109 points, while his little brother Anton notched 85 points himself. Meanwhile, out of nowhere, 28-year-old winger Jacques Richard exploded for 52 goals, while Goulet chipped in 71 points and rookie center Dale Hunter added 63. All told, the Nordiques had a half dozen players aged 29 or younger record more than 60 points. Just 1 year removed from being a doormat, the Nordiques were one of the most compelling teams in the league. And while their first trip to the postseason ended in first-round heartbreak, the Nordiques had put the NHL on notice. They had arrived. And speaking of arrivals, another Stastny brother, their oldest brother, Marion, arrived in Quebec City that offseason. And when the three of them suited up for the Nordiques in 1981-82, they made history, becoming just the third trio of brothers to play on the same pro hockey team together. They also helped the Nordiques to their greatest triumph yet. That season, with all three Stastny brothers averaging more than a point per game and monster years from Cloutier and Goulet, Quebec captured a second straight playoff berth while managing their best record to date. As fate would have it though, their first-round opponent was none other than their greatest adversary, the Goliath to their David, the Canadiens, who captured their 8th straight division title in 81-82 with their 8th straight 100-point season. To say that Quebec was enthralled by the Nordiques-Canadiens playoff showdown would be l'exagération du siècle, the overstatement of the century. This is exactly what the NHL hoped for when it realigned its divisions in 81 to put Montreal and Quebec together. But nobody could have anticipated just how unforgettable the first ever Battle of Quebec postseason edition would be. In Game 1 in Montreal, the favored Canadiens very much looked the part. They took the lead less than a minute into the game and never looked back, bullying Quebec en route to a 5-1 victory. But the Nordiques didn't quit. They clawed their way to a 3-2 win in Game 2 to send the best of 5 back to Quebec City tied at 1 game apiece, then outlasted the Canadiens in a tight Game 3 to put themselves 1 win away from their first ever postseason series victory. Obviously though, this series was going 5 games. With their backs against the wall in Game 4 at the Coliseum, the Canadiens took care of business, exploding for 6 goals in a chippy victory that featured a combined 249 penalty minutes. So, Game 5, in Montreal. Either way, this was history, a touchpoint not just in the rivalry between the Habs and Nordiques, but for the province of Quebec. And sure enough, after 60 minutes of hockey, the game was tied 2-2. Overtime. Not even 30 seconds into the extra frame though, the Nordiques found themselves on an odd man rush, and Hunter authored one of the most memorable moments of his 19-year NHL career.
À Jarvis, à Engblom, à Gainé, une sortie de zone, et là attaque à 2 contre 1. Cloutier à Hunter, et il rate le filet, revient devant, et là c'est bloqué, et quel...
Où est la rondelle? Le but est bon.
Et les Nordiques ont emporté.
À 22 secondes seulement.
The Nordiques had done it. They had vanquished the Canadiens, and in Montreal to boot. And that impossibly tense 5-game series served as a gripping opening chapter in the lengthy playoff history between the two teams. From 81 through 87, a span of 7 seasons, the Nordiques made the playoffs every single year. During that period, they met their interprovincial rival in the postseason 4 times. And although the Canadiens finished with the better regular season record more often than not, they split those 4 series down the middle. Quebec won in 82, of course, but the Canadiens defeated the Nordiques when they met in the second round in 84, a series best remembered for its decisive and violent Game 6, a 4-0 Montreal victory known as the Good Friday Massacre. The following year, however, the Nordiques got their revenge, beating Montreal in 7 games in the second round. And in 87, it was Montreal winning a 7-game series in round 2 over Quebec. In 86, I should point out, the Nordiques got swept by Hartford in the first round, while the Canadiens won the Stanley Cup. Ultimately though, that stretch of 7 straight playoff seasons, featuring multiple postseason victories over Montreal, was undoubtedly the golden era of Nordiques hockey. Yet, the ultimate prize eluded them. In fact, Quebec never once made it past the conference finals, and by the time they got beat by Montreal in the 87 playoffs, on the heels of a sub-500 regular season, it was clear that that core had missed its window. From there, things went south in a hurry. In 87-88, the Nordiques finished in last place in their division for the first time since their inaugural NHL season. And the following year, despite debuting a promising young rookie named Joe Sakic, the Nordiques ended up tied for the fewest points in the NHL. Still, they hadn't yet hit rock bottom. That came in 1989-90, when the Nordiques squeaked out only 12 wins, finishing with one of the worst records in NHL history. Even Guy Lafleur couldn't turn this group into a respectable one. And that year, the Nordiques severed their last major ties to their glory days, trading away both Peter Stastny and Goulet, the franchise's 2 most prolific all-time scorers. And not surprisingly, as the team scuffled, fan support dwindled. By 1990, the Nordiques had the 7th lowest per-game attendance in the league. Among the few teams that drew worse than them that year, the Hartford Whalers, the Winnipeg Jets, the Minnesota North Stars. And what do all those teams have in common? Yeah, they'd all ceased to exist by the end of the decade. That said, as bleak as things may have looked for Quebec, the Nordiques had a much clearer path back to respectability than those other teams. They had a new franchise cornerstone in Sakic, who put up 102 points in 1990, and thanks to their incredible struggles at the turn of the decade, they had not 1, not 2, but 3 consecutive #1 overall picks. With the first overall pick in 1989, they selected a Swedish standout named Mats Sundin. With the first overall pick in 1990, they drafted a gifted power forward named Owen Nolan. And with the first overall pick in 1991, they landed the most tantalizing prospect since Mario Lemieux, a junior superstar named L'affaire Lindros, the singular talent who would immediately turn the Nordiques back into a contender. There was only one problem. Lindros didn't want to play for Quebec. Why? Well, the most popular theories were the team's lack of recent success, the difficulty of landing big-time endorsement deals in a small market like Quebec City, and the fact that Quebec is a francophone province with a heavy tax rate. As it turned out though, the real reason was that Lindros just didn't like Obu, the team's president. Still, the Nordiques took him first overall anyway. But Lindros stuck to his guns. He held out for the entire 91-92 NHL season, and the chaos and uncertainty surrounding L'affaire Lindros wasn't resolved until June of 92, when the Nordiques sent him to Philadelphia in one of the most transformative trades in NHL history. In exchange for Lindros, the Nordiques received a recently drafted Swedish phenom named Peter Forsberg, former Vezina Trophy winner Ron Hextall, up-and-coming forward Mike Ricci, perennial 20-goal scorer Steve Duchesne, 2 more players, Philly's first-round picks in 1993 and 1994, plus $15 million in cash. It was a doozy of a deal, and it's hard to imagine that Lindros alone could have been more impactful than that haul was for the Nordiques, who turned into a juggernaut overnight. In 92-93, coming off a 20-win season and a 5th straight last-place finish in their division, the Nordiques were one of the best teams in the NHL. With their highly touted youngsters blossoming into stars and major contributions from their trade acquisitions, the Nordiques exploded for 47 wins and 104 points, a 52-point improvement from their previous season. It was the first 100-point season in franchise history, in fact, and the new-look Nordiques cruised into the playoffs. That said, they lost in the first round to, wait for it, the Montreal Canadiens, who went on to capture their 24th, and as of this moment, most recent Stanley Cup title. Still, the Nordiques were in a good spot. They were suddenly overflowing with young talent, and Forsberg hadn't even made his NHL debut yet. Except there was one key figure who wasn't heartened by the Nordiques' resurgence: Obu. Although the team's turnaround on the ice led to solid attendance figures throughout the early to mid-90s, according to Obu, the Nordiques' finances were in dire straits. Between escalating payroll costs, the uniquely small Quebec City market, and the Canadian dollar's then waning strength, the Nordiques were said to be unviable. In fact, Obu even approached the provincial government for a bailout. And then some. According to the Washington Post, Obu asked Quebec not only for a new $100 million arena, but also for another almost $30 million to cover operating losses. The province eventually made a counteroffer that would have bought them an ownership stake in the team, but Obu said no. The writing was on the wall. And not just for the Nordiques. Several other small market teams found themselves staring down the barrel of potential relocation. Then the dominoes started to fall. In 1993, the Minnesota North Stars up and left for Dallas. By decade's end, the Jets had moved to Phoenix, and the Whalers had moved to Raleigh, North Carolina. And along the way, the Nordiques met their demise too. In May of '95, Obu sold the Nordiques for $75 million to Comsat, an American telecommunications company that also happened to own the NBA's Denver Nuggets. And sure enough, Comsat also intended to move the Nordiques to the Mile High City and rebrand them into the Colorado Avalanche. The sale not only marked the return of NHL hockey to Colorado, which had a team briefly in the mid-70s and early 80s, but it also afforded the city of Denver a ready-made contender. In fact, in their first season of existence, the Colorado Avalanche were Stanley Cup champions. In the almost 3 decades since, the Avalanche have won 2 more, while the Nordiques' 16-year run in the NHL has been largely forgotten. You'd be hard-pressed to find a Gen Z-aged hockey fan outside of Quebec who would even recognize the nickname. However, almost 30 years later, there's at least a smidgen of hope of a renaissance for the Nordiques. Quebec City unveiled a new 18,000-seat arena in 2015 in the hopes of luring the NHL back, and NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman said in 2024 that he remains open to the possibility of the NHL's return to Quebec City.
If we decide to expand and Quebec City expresses the type of interest necessary to make it happen, then we'll review it.
Perhaps then, the story of the Nordiques isn't actually over. It's just a sweeve to be continued.